Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. We've talked about it for the last week and a half. When you're talking about a football game between Ohio State and Oregon, two of what I think is the two most talented rosters that you see in all of college football, you can talk matchups all you want. At the end of the day, it's going to come down to players making plays to win this football game. And that's the fun part when you're talking about this Oregon team because of how talented this team is. It might not necessarily be the same player every single week, but so far it's worked for Oregon where, hey, different players, every single game are stepping up and helping this Oregon team win. Now, going into this matchup against Ohio State, what players can really change the game for this Oregon Ducks program? Want to get into that. It's going to be kind of a variety of different names. I picked 5, and I think the unique part about this conversation, you could probably pick 20 if you wanted to. So would love to hear from y'all in the comment section in terms of what player are you looking at and saying, hey, this player needs to step up and change the game for Oregon. Let it fly in the comment section. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. The amount of support the Oregon fans have shown the boys really for the last 12 months as we covered this team in the transfer portal, gearing up for a national championship run, then covering them all of 2024. Can't thank you guys enough. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's go off the beaten path a little bit. Talk about a player that the national media ain't going to talk about. The broadcast probably not going to talk about too much. Linebacker Devin Jackson. He doesn't quote unquote start for Oregon, but there's been a lot of games where Oregon has gone to Devin Jackson, a little bit more of a juiced up athletic linebacker. This is the game where you go to. And you go back to Devin Jackson in the regular season. What game did he play the most amount of snaps in for this Oregon defense? It was Ohio State in the regular season. Why is that? You look at Ohio State's offense, they are geared to run to the perimeter. I mean, they want to get their plays going to the boundary. And if you want a defense that can successfully deal with that, all that speed, all that playmaking, you need linebackers who can go sideline to sideline and that can cover ground really, really fast. When you're talking about players that can cover ground really, really fast, it doesn't get better at the linebacker spot than Devin Jackson, right? A 10-5 in the 100-meter dash coming out of high school. He is probably the fastest linebacker that you see in the country. You look at Ohio State, they're going to want to get some of the quick game to the perimeter. They want to get their run scheme is going to the perimeter. They made Tennessee's linebackers look stuck in the mud last weekend. Hey, you look at this matchup and say, we need linebackers who can fly out to the boundary and go make plays in space and cover a lot of distance quickly. I think Devin Jackson is that guy. Now, does that mean Devin Jackson starts? Maybe not. I'd probably go with Jeff Boston, Bryce Betcher, like Oregon has done the whole year. But it's hard not to see Devin Jackson playing a lot of football against an Ohio State offense that has as much speed as they do. If you're playing a team like Michigan, maybe Devin Jackson doesn't play as much and you want kind of your heavy hitting linebackers who can play in a phone booth, Jeff Boston, Bryce Betcher. But in this kind of game where it's going to be played in space, you look at Devin Jackson and say he's one of those rare linebackers that can provide the adequate speed to deal with all the athleticism that Ohio State has on offense. And you look at where Ohio State has had a lot of success, it's been making defenses look slow. It's hard to make a guy like Devin Jackson look slow. Number 2, and this is a guy that has played a large part and why Oregon has been so dominant in 2024, Derek Harmon. Now, why am I going to Derek Harmon versus a guy like Mateo Yu or a guy like Tatum Tuioti? I'm going with Derek Harmon because you look at the question marks that Ohio State has on the offensive line. It's in the middle of this offensive line with all the injuries that they've kind of endured. I mean, Tiger Shabolda, Carson Hisman at the center position. Those are guys that if you were to ask Ryan Day, put a lie detector onto his arm and say, hey, where are the biggest concerns that you have going up and playing Oregon? It's probably on the inside of the offensive line. Now, Tennessee did some good things impacting this Ohio State defense from the interior of the defensive line, but probably didn't have enough firepower. You go back to that Michigan game, the game Ohio State lost to, the real reason that Ohio State struggled the most in that football game is they were getting whipped on the inside. There are not many difference maker, game wrecker interior defensive linemen like a Mason Graham. To me, Derek Harmon is probably one of those guys, and he's going to play a role in a couple of different ways. One, you don't necessarily need to sack Will Howard to make him uncomfortable. You go back to that Michigan game. Michigan did not sack Will Howard once in that football game. They had 4 tackles for loss, but 0 sacks. But what they did have was 19 quarterback hurries. That disruption from the inside of this defensive line gave Will Howard a lot of problems. And you look at Will Howard as a passer, when he's kept clean in the pocket, he can make some big time throws. 78% completion percentage, 2,500 yards, 24 touchdowns. The numbers for Will Howard when he's kept clean, really, really dang good. When he's under pressure, that completion percentage drops to 50%. Only 600 yards, 5 touchdowns to 3 interceptions. It's not necessarily what the box score is going to say, although you want to get negative plays, you want to create some sacks. But if you're Derek Carman, how much chaos can you put Will Howard in these big moments? That's probably what you're looking at. If you're Oregon on the defensive side of the football, that's the matchup that going into this game, you probably feel great about. It's not saying you don't feel good about Jabbar Muhammad, Nico Reed on the outside. That's probably going to be a wash, right? There's a really good Ohio State wide receivers. It's a really good Oregon secondary. The one matchup that you think you got the players to really, really take advantage of is on the inside of the defensive line, going up against an Ohio State interior offensive line that at times when they've played dudes have struggled big time. So Derek Carman, certainly a name I'm looking at. Next one on the list, and you guys know I was going to include him, Kenyon Sadiq. Well, what fascinates me about this matchup here is you go back to that game in the regular season, Oregon-Ohio State. Kenyon Sadiq played 11 snaps in that football game. 0 targets, 0 catches, was largely a non-factor. Go back to how we started this conversation. It's about players making some big-time plays and some big-time moments. Kenyon Sadiq's one of those guys that can change the game every time he touches the football. He's the definition of a matchup nightmare, 6'4", 245, 10-7 speed in the 100-meter. You had 3 weeks about to prepare for this one, and I'm guessing a lot of that time was preparing for Ohio State because you probably expected them to win that football game at home. Do you have something in the playbook, Will Stein, to get Kenyon Sadiq a touch where Ohio State hasn't seen it on the film yet, and you feel like this is the big advantage of Oregon having that bye week? You get an extra couple of weeks to really put some stuff into the offense that you haven't shown yet. Kenyon Sadiq, if there's something Oregon hasn't shown yet, I feel like it's going to be with Kenyon Sadiq getting the football. I don't need him to play 40 snaps, but I do want him to get a couple of touches and give him the opportunity to change the game one time in this football game. Kenyon Sadiq, a name I'm looking at. Next on the list, this one I think is obvious. It's Evan Stewart. If Ohio State even comes close to having the same defensive game plan that they had the first go around, where it's, hey, we're going to do everything we can to take away Tez Johnson. We're going to bracket him. We're going to put a safety over top. We are going to put a lot of attention going to Tez Johnson in the slot. What happened was you're leaving Evan Stewart one-on-one with some good boundary cornerbacks in Davison Igbinosun and Denzel Burke, but Evan Stewart's a good wide receiver in and of itself. You have a feeling that Evan Stewart's going to have that chance to make some of those plays like he did last year, or not last year, but last game against Ohio State. Can Evan Stewart make some of those plays? It's been kind of a roller coaster ride for Evan Stewart. It's no secret. This passing attack goes through Tez Johnson, then it goes through Terrence Ferguson. Evan Stewart at times has been a focal piece in games, and at times you go back to the Penn State game, had 0 catches, only 1 target. If Ohio State wants to take away the middle of the field with guys like Tez Johnson and Terrence Ferguson, well, if you're going to try to do that, you're going to give Evan Stewart his matchups. Can Evan Stewart win like he did last game on the outside, provide some of those game-changing explosive plays? That's what you're probably looking at in this football game. And then the question is, all right, if they want to try to take away Evan Stewart and say, hey, we just saw what Evan Stewart did to us last game, we're going to try to put a safety more close to the boundary, take away him, then you run the risk of letting Tez Johnson just run all over you. And so we'll see what Ohio State does. If I'm guessing, they're going to try to do a similar thing where, hey, we're going to try to take away Tez Johnson, take away T-Ferg, take away that middle of the field. Well, if you do that, it's just a numbers game. And Evan Stewart has some looks on the outside. Can you get Evan Stewart those opportunities to go change the game? Last player I want to talk about, and largely just the unit as a whole, is Oregon's offensive line versus the Ohio State defensive line. This, to me, is probably the biggest matchup you're going to see. These are two just heavyweight fighters going head-to-head. I mean, a bunch of NFL dudes on Oregon's offensive line, a bunch of NFL dudes on Ohio State's defensive line. The first matchup, Oregon won pretty handily. Ohio State had 0 sacks, only 2 tackles for loss. And what that allowed Oregon to do is, one, kind of control how this game was being played. But I think number two, stay on schedule. I mean, you look at Oregon running the football, not taking negative plays. That's where you want to live. Not only for this Oregon offense, keep that whole playbook open. But you also, Jim Knowles, Ohio State's defensive coordinator, is one of the best in the business at dialing it up when it's in 3rd and long. How do you avoid getting into those 3rd and long situations? You run the football well. You don't take negative plays. You stay on schedule. You really limit the amount of creativity Ohio State can put in this defense. This Oregon offensive line, if they win this game, I guarantee you, Oregon's offensive line wins the matchup. It's a really good offensive line, really good Ohio State defensive line. Can you run the football? Can you not take negative plays? Can you stay on schedule? If you do that, you probably put yourself in a really good chance to win this football game. Those are the 5 names that I have. Again, you could talk about Jabbar Muhammad and Jeremiah Smith on the outside. You could talk about Mateo Yu coming off the edge against these Ohio State tackles. To me, these are the 5 players that I think really can change the game for this Oregon Ducks program. We'll sign out there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Gonna be a heck of a football game, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.